Hello, everyone. This is Moritz Bierling, Director of Research at Exosphere. This is the first of a series of interviews with fellows of the Exosphere Academy, as well as people from our network who do interesting things in science, technology, and entrepreneurship, and also at the intersection of all of these. As you see, these are not separate fields as such, but rather interconnect, are connected in the vast universe of knowledge. And the careers that people take in these fields often jump from one place to another. And so we're going to have a few conversations with people in that domain of interest, whose careers kind of examples of those interesting journeys. And today I have with me Micah Redding. Micah is the founder of the Christian Transhumanist Association, and he's also a web developer, but much more than that, which he will go into in a little bit. From my reading that I did in preparation for the show of your blog and of the newsletter that you put out regularly, I came across one of your articles, a more recent one that was called, I believe, Every Country is a Developing Country. And I really liked the thought in there. Could you elaborate on that first?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. Yeah, so this is based on a TEDx talk that I actually gave earlier this year called "We All Live in the Developing World."
Right.
And it was based on my some things I'd been thinking about and kind of concept I've been working with. But back in December, I was actually visiting some people in Nigeria, and it really kind of struck me how different the world was in Nigeria versus a lot of other places that I've been and the places that I grew up and all that. And you know, it occurred to me that we have this concept of the developed and the developing world, and that idea is, I think, a really dangerous one, because it suggests that part of our world is developed, it's done, it's complete, and it has nothing left to do. And the other part of the world is developing, and so it's just trying to mimic what the developed world has already done. And I think, you know, my basic premise is that's a really disastrous idea for a lot of reasons. One of which is that if we had 7 billion people living like an average North American, it would take 4 Earths to supply that. So we can't do that. We actually need new developments, new ideas, new technologies that change the way we live, not just kind of extend the way that Americans live to the rest of the world. And that means that we all have to do this work of creating new possibilities. So I think it starts with recognizing we all live in a developing world, and it's our job to do that development.
Right. Yeah, I think it relates a little bit to that concept that we've seen quite a few times pop up in popular interest, especially on Facebook. When I scroll through my feed, people often refer to it. And that's the basic divide between the fixed and the growth mindset. Mm-hmm. So we think about countries in this way that, okay, we're at a finished point now, but it also applies to individual human psychology and kind of that developing mindset where you see your life not as attaining a certain status and then stopping there, but rather as a continual series of developments. I think that also relates a lot to Christianity, at least in how you perceive it. Could you go into that a bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I understand Christianity in a way that I think is very orthodox, but it's unusual for people because maybe it's an older kind of framing, and so it's not as common. And so one of the big pictures, I think, you know, Christianity is out for the renewal of the world. That's the kind of vision of Christianity, is that God creates humans to engage in this process of transformative work to continue the kind of work of creation. That's what it means to be made in the image of God. So that's the kind of starting point. But then when we talk about, well, what that actually means, well, it means that we have to be creative beings. We're made in the image of a creator, and we're supposed to be creative ourselves. We're supposed to be bringing new things into existence. And so one concept that's been really helpful for me is the idea of functional fixedness. And functional fixedness is this thing that psychologists have discovered when they do tests on young children. they'll find out that if they give them a problem such as hold this piece of paper down on this table, that if they are 5 years old or older, they will they'll look for a paperweight, and if they don't find a paperweight, they'll be like, this is an impossible task. But if they're 5 years old or younger, they'll look around and they'll find things like hammers or shoes or any cups or anything else, and they'll see this as a possible solution. So functional fixedness, as we get older, we get locked into seeing things only working in a certain way. But as young children, we have that kind of open-ended creativity with the things in our environment. And so Jesus has a famous statement. He says, you must become like a little child. And I think there's something to that, like to move into that kind of open-ended growth mindset to where, we can use things in any way as creative agents is really the key to what it means to be human. And that's kind of the core to my understanding of Christianity.
Right. I mean, what I imagine that people think about when think about Christianity, this is not what they envision somebody thinking of. When I think of what I see in the US, when the normal liberal person thinks about is a Christian conservative, they think of somebody who's anti-science, pro-life, who is Bible touting, is this beautiful derogatory term. How does Christianity have this image in today's world, and how is it possible for you to have a completely different conception of it? And I think your own experience with the Christian community, I would like to know more about that.
Yeah, so I grew up. I grew up as a preacher's kid in a small conservative church, and we actually. So we would move every few years, and so I lived all over the country in these small little conservative churches, and so maybe the kind of vision that you're talking about is probably pretty close to my background, but one of the things that in the churches I grew up in was always emphasized was the idea of study. Like study for yourself. And the assumption was that you would study and you would come up with the same conclusions that everybody else did. But there was still that idea, like, you need to study this, figure this out, because this is important. And so I did. I took that seriously. And as I did, I began to dig deeper into Christian history and into the broader kind of actual Christian experience. And I realized that what happens a lot of times is that I think this happens to a lot of cultures. It's happened to Christianity in America, where you get locked in, you've seen a certain thing, and you think this has been this way forever. Right. But actually, it's not. It hasn't. This is your particular very small experience. And so it's important for us to have that sense of history, like what's been changing for the last 2,000 years, what's been going on, because most Christians throughout history would not recognize American conservatism as being like in any way. They would just say, I don't know what that is. So once I had personally kind of as a teenager started doing that research and uncovering that, I really realized that Christianity, the most orthodox traditional versions of Christianity, have a real powerful idea about the importance of the material world and our necessity to be working in it transformatively, to be bringing new life out of it. And really that's the oldest kind of religious vision, I believe. And it's what's happened is that, we see in modern American conservative fundamentalism this kind of escapism where it's like all about getting out of the world or getting to heaven or something like that, but it's not about what we do here. And I think that's a real mistake. It's a loss of context and a loss of perspective. And I think there's a lot of cultural reasons it happens, but it's not really a true representation of what Christianity has historically been.
Right. Yeah, this transformative developmental approach to working in the world. We touched on this already earlier, but this seems to me also to be the connecting link to transhumanism. Am I right there?
Yeah, it's absolutely. So once I discovered in my own study as a teenager that I was drawn much more towards kind of Orthodox Christianity and that thought process, then I immediately recognized that I was a transhumanist. And this was around the time I started, exploring kind of niche online communities, and I found these communities of transhumanists, most of whom were very secular. And so I began engaging with them, and they were like, what is this weird preacher's kid doing here? And what I found is that most of them had a negative experience with Christianity. That was, kind of what we've described, and had decided that they wanted to do something good in the world, and were working to do so, right? And they were trying to do so while kind of reclaiming some of the aspiration and the ambition of religious sensibility. And so I recognized that they were doing in this kind of secular framing exactly what this whole other kind of Orthodox Christian world was doing, and what I was uncovering. And so I recognized that those were ultimately the same kinds of effort. And it's been interesting, the dialogue over the years, because that communication is weird. People don't see that connection, but I immediately made that connection. And so ultimately that led, years down the road, to being involved with other Christian transhumanists, other spiritual transhumanists, and we eventually founded the Christian Transhumanist Association to kind of provoke these awkward conversations between people who don't normally talk. So yeah, that's been how I got into it, very much so. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The saying comes to mind: if you don't want to be a victim of the strangeness, be an agent of the strangeness.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's what we are. Yeah,
you're doing that work.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. So with the agent, or with the association, you are trying to provoke these conversations both in the secular communities but also in the religious communities. So
yeah.
Can you give us some insight into how those conversations go and how they compare between these different communities? Because when I imagine a transhumanist learning about your association, they would probably, be very confounded, and the same thing for a Christian. And do these people actually ever overlap, other than where you work, where you do that work?
Yeah, so there's a whole spectrum of responses from people who are like, on the transhumanist side, who are like, get these religious people out of our stuff,
right?
Because the perception there is that religion is just a damaging or destructive force, and based on real experiences. There's that at one end, and then there's kind of the middle response in the transhumanism kind of area, where people are like, that's interesting, I don't quite get it, but but that's interesting. And then I think you find a certain number of people who have been in transhumanism for a while, but have recognized that there needs to be a larger connection with our kind of cultural and artistic and aesthetic selves, and are intrigued by religion, because that's traditionally what religion has provided, right? This connection to kind of the complete human experience. And so it's not enough to simply be like, okay, we're going to build a bigger rocket. We need to be inspired to build a bigger rocket. We need to know why we're going to do all that risk to
supporting structure.
Rocket. Yeah, and it's a really big thing, and people underestimate how much a sense of vision and imagination and aesthetics really goes into that.
Right.
So that's kind of how it happens over here. On the Christian side of things, we get all the same kind of span of things from people who think transhumanism is the mark of the beast, and you do get some of those, to people who are just a little bit unsure about it and are kind of filling it out. To a lot of people who are like, well, I've never heard of this before, but it sounds great, so let's go for it. What I think is happening is that there's currently a pretty big move to rethinking and reframing religion. A lot of people are questioning a lot of things at least in North America, and just reevaluating, you know, everything. And as they're doing that, they're discovering a lot of the same things that I discovered, in terms of, you know, Christianity has a lot of resources for connecting much more fully to things we can do in the world, right, and not, you know, not being so escapist. And so I think a lot of people are in motion towards what we're talking about, and saying Christian transhumanism kind of connects those dots. And so I think there's a lot of need for it.
Right. Yeah. When I think back about my own upbringing, I mean, I'm culturally Christian, but my parents never made a big deal out of being Christian. I mean,
right,
they're Protestants. My mom goes to church at Christmas and for singing when somebody dies, and so, yeah, but not much more than that. So when I was learning about my own heritage, Christianity was something that I had to discover by myself, and I'm still not at a point where I would say, okay, I call myself a Christian that truly believes in the Creator God of Christianity, which doesn't keep me from seeing religious people in a good light. Like I definitely went through a period where I was militant atheist, and also saw how Christopher Hitchens called it, religion is, I think, what does it say? Religion is poison, or something like that.
Okay, yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, God is not great. How religion, yeah, poisons everything. Right.
Yeah.
That was one of his books. And they kind of came from that mindset. And he had very good arguments. But over time, I learned, and I actually met people who were Christians and who were very honest, very bright, and very courageous people. And I could not square that with my own with my own, yeah, previous judgment. So I think there's a tendency to even in the scientific and secular circles to go all religious in their scientism, in a sense. And I think you're doing some of the work to kind of pry that apart again and foster that conversation. One point that interests me here is you in your work with the Christian Transhumanist Association, you're doing all these conversations with people. Now, what are some of the challenges that having these conversations with these people actually allows us to move forward on? I remember when we had a private conversation when you were here at the Academy, you talked about how, for example, genetic engineering or spacefaring, these are challenges that require a lot of people to get behind. And if we can mobilize the Christian and religious communities across the US, but also in the broader world, then we can do that.
Yeah. So yeah, this is the thing I think people don't spend enough time considering, which is that a lot of people in the world are religious, right? There are billions of religious people in the world, and that's not an accident. And the thing about the kind of, you know, religion is poison and that kind of narrative is that what it tends to do is it takes fundamentalism and it says this is the truest version of the religion and everything else is just kind of a watered down version of it. But, you know, if you look at it as a sociological thing and just actually say, well, what's actually happening in the world? Fundamentalism is a very small element, a very small, you know, it has a big effect, but it's a small thing, and it's kind of a divergent force that's reacting to certain kinds of stress and so forth. And it's a really new thing. It's newer than the 1900s. So you know, religion has a big effect in the world, and it has more of an effect than we typically give it credit for when we kind of just think of it as this, you know, very narrow band of things. And so, yeah, when we want to go and solve big problems, it makes sense to say, let's get as many people working on these problems as possible. You know, not just like, let's work to make sure people aren't opposing us, which is a big question, but let's make sure we actually have support behind this of large parts of our society. And the way that most people, you know, kind of process, what should I support? What is a useful thing to really dedicate my life to? is through the value systems that are shaped by these religions.
Right.
And so if you're trying to get people to go to Mars, or if you're trying to start a big genetic engineering project, you have a lot of uphill battles, right? You have a lot of things. You have to convince a lot of people that this is okay, that this is going to be good. But then you have to get a lot of people on board to support it. You know, who's going to go to your Mars colony, right? Which, when it's probably going to mean, you know, that's the rest of your life or something, right? That's a big sacrifice. So traditionally, who makes those sacrifices? You know, it's people who really believe that there's something worth pursuing. You know, this connects to a bigger value system. So yeah, this is, I mean, all kinds of things. A big thing for me, I think space travel is a big thing we need to really be on top of as a species, for a lot of reasons. One of which is just all the resources that are available once we get out there. Another is kind of life insurance. And you know, I think a big one is giving us a new frontier, kind of, you know, keeping our imagination able to continue to grow. Another big thing that I'm very interested in is just kind of radical life extension. And Google has a project for this, Calico Labs, which is working on life extension. So does there's a number of others, Aubrey de Grey and the SINS Foundation and things like that. And this is something I really think goes to the core of a lot of religious values. Life is good, and we should be extending it. And that's a very core, particularly Christian value. And so that's something I want to see a lot more religious people get behind. And you know, there's so many payoffs to that. But one of them is, you know, if we extend life, then we have what I call the great-great-grandmother effect, where we start having people stay around who have, you know, built up the kind of wisdom and knowledge it takes, you know, not just 50 years, but maybe 100 years to obtain. Right. And I think that can make for a much wiser culture. So a lot of that fits with a very religious value system. I think it makes a lot of sense for people who are working in these fields to say, let's reach out to religious people, because this could mean the difference between this and, you know, everything. So right,
yes, that makes a lot of sense. At the academy itself, we also have several streams that go in this direction. The Mars colonization stream itself, we have Dr. Jewel from Mars, not from Mars, of course, but from the Mars Society, and then we also have the biohacking streams, which are with Gabriel Vicina and Justin Atkin. And at the same time, we also have a philosophy stream. Now, we don't have a religion stream because that would be kind of interesting to teach religion as something that people pay for as an education. But in our academy, we regularly foster the kind of exchange or conversation that you are trying to also do with the association. And I'm happy that we had those conversations also back at the last academy. Yeah. Now, one of the conversations we also talked more into the direction of what does it actually take to succeed, whatever that means for an individual person, in this strange economy that seems all out of whack, and there's not really much that people trust to be certain over longer periods of time than a few years. Your career itself, I think, speaks to that a little bit. Can you go into that a bit?
Yeah. So I've had a weird career. So I graduated with a computer science degree, then went out and became a rock musician for about 8 years. And as I was touring around as a rock musician, I started, you know, I kind of followed my interests, which, you know, I was like, okay, well, we need to build a website for our music. And then, you know, so I started doing that for other people, and I started really digging into what the technologies were that were involved in creating web applications at that point in time. And pretty soon that kind of led me to really specializing in certain kinds of content management systems and things like that. And yeah, ultimately that kind of led into this, you know, what the rest of my kind of software development career has been. So I did the education part up front, but I didn't use it for a very long time.
Right.
And by the time that I actually used that formal education, I mean, I was doing totally different things, right? But what I kind of did, I went from working in just for people who are familiar with web technologies, you know, just from HTML and CSS. Actually, CSS was kind of new at the time, but into using content management systems like Drupal and stuff like that, to extending those to the point where I kind of ran into a complexity wall, moved over to Ruby on Rails, started, you know, building that, you know, building into that space. And that's been my process. And every, you know, every step of the way, I've been trying to make smart decisions, but it hasn't been like a big architected plan, right? Like I didn't know where I was going to be 10 years from now, but at every step I was like, okay, what's the interesting thing for me to learn and explore right now? Right. What increases my optionality? And that's been a big thing. Because yeah, you don't know, like we don't know what's going to be, you know, the technologies I'm using today will be different in 5 years, you know, absolutely. But by exploring those things and always trying to make sure I was kind of maintaining this kind of learning loop, right? Like I'm always in the process of learning. It's increasing my kind of what I think of as horizontal options. So, you know, if suddenly I need to pivot or some new opportunity comes around, you know, I can switch into some totally different job in a sense, right? Because I'm kind of increasing the skill set all the time. And part of working as a software developer is really not just like you learn how to use the tools, but you learn how to think about using tools and how to find new tools. Right. And so we're always kind of moving that problem solving space where it's not just here's a specific skill, but it's like, how do I find a specific skill when needed? Right. Like the thing that's going to fit this particular problem. How do I solve a problem? And if you really get comfortable with that process, then that becomes a very open-ended thing that you can apply to lots and lots of different situations and scenarios.
Right, yeah. I mean, this particular interview series is an example. I've never done something like this before, but let's just jump into it. Let's get started, and then along the way, I'll figure out how it goes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this lifelong learning is a very important feature of succeeding in the creative economy. But also another one is being able to have productive and cooperative or collaborative relationships with people that are totally unlike you. So I imagine you're kind of an interesting guy because you both have that rock star thing and then also the computer science thing. Like in a more limited mind, that might not go together as easily. But for like when you think back to like how the college stereotypes are, there's the jock, there's the geek or nerd, and then these people don't have much to do with each other. And often that kind of stereotype holds true, and then also stays true for a lot of people when they follow their career. Like you think the geek goes into the computer science stuff, becomes a coder, and then the jock maybe works a car salesman job or something like that. But actually, because the today's job board is so much in flux, not staying with one thing is probably not going to be sufficient for your entire career. So if you want to hear about new opportunities or succeed when you get those new opportunities, it's often very important to be able to work with people who are totally unlike you. And if that means for the computer scientist or the geek at the conference to at least look up to the shoes of the others and not his own, then that's what it takes, right?
Yeah, I think you know, communication is a huge thing, and it's so Yeah, it typically is so hard to find in the tech world, right? So when you can you can bring that ability to communicate to it, it's a real asset, um, because ultimately, like, it's about understanding where you're fitting at the moment into this bigger picture. And so many, the kind of corporate stereotype is that you're going to be a cog in a machine, and you're going to get to be a really good cog.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to really kind of, buckle down to that. And what happens is, people get locked in, right? This is the way my job is supposed to work. And if something doesn't quite go right, or, something, then I'm going to be mad because I'm not getting things the way that I've expected them. But what that makes you really fragile, right? Because now if something changes, then maybe your job goes away, maybe the nature of it changes, and you're not fitting anymore because you're locked into it working in this particular way, and it becomes a really problematic thing for the people around you, which means it's a problematic thing for you. And we, there's all these movies and stuff like that where they play out this scenario. Somebody's like worked at something for years and years and years, and then they like, surprise, you're fired, right, because everything's changed. And when you think about that, why didn't they know that things were changing? Why weren't you aware of it? And a lot of that is, that we buy into that false idea that we just need to be that particular cog and do this particular thing. But actually, you need to be able to do that, your kind of particular skill, whatever that is at the moment, but try to understand like where you fit in the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. Because that bigger picture is where, that's where the value is coming from. Like this, right, your job is fulfilling some other thing. And the more you can communicate with all the rest of that world and understand it, the less you're going to get blindsided, the more you're going to be able to change and pivot and adapt to an ongoing kind of, the just evolution of the marketplace. But yeah, that, what you're saying about like, we don't know, people are like, I don't know what things are going to be. And that's true. And rather than trying to fix that ambiguity, we need to learn to be comfortable with it, to be comfortable with that level of change, and not try to figure out everything at the beginning, but figure out things when they need to be figured out, and right, make choices.
Our brains are still running very old hardware, I guess. Mm-hmm. And our world has changed a lot in that time.
Yeah.
While you were speaking, this thought came to me about the idea of vocation. And I think it has a special meaning in Christian tradition. And I wonder, how does somebody go after that? Or what is vocation even? Like, when I speak with our founder Skinner often about these things, we go back to Nassim Taleb's idea about using the barbell strategy, which is that you find something that pays your bills today, something that is unlikely to go out of fashion quickly, let's say accounting, and then you work that job, you kind of play it safe in that sense, and then on the other hand, you also put your free time and your interests into one basket, or not in one basket, in many baskets, and play around there to find things that you are uniquely good at, or that you can combine in a way that nobody else can, and then try to take that vertical and develop that in that direction.
Yeah, I think a similar thought that I've kind of expressed to other people is this idea of having a hard skill and a soft skill. So it's good to be able to say, to go to a business or whoever and say, oh, I do, this very specific thing. Like I do accounting, or, like I can keep your books, or, something that's really easy to quantify, and kind of like everybody can be like, oh yeah, we need that. But then to be able to bring something else to the table that is, not necessarily part of that, right? But maybe it's really good communication skills. Maybe it's some other kind of aspect to the way that you are, you know, something unique about you, then that brings all kinds of new dynamics into play, I think. And it creates, I think of it kind of almost as a lightning rod, like you have one thing in the air and one thing in the ground, and the difference between those two things attracts energy, you know, by creating this tension between, you know, like, oh, I, you know, have this really weird technical skill over here and this really, you know, really aggressive soft skill over here. You know, maybe I'm a graphic designer and an accountant, and somehow the dynamic tension between those two things will introduce new possibilities. And I don't know what those possibilities will be, but so yeah, I think that can, it's almost like, yeah, having one foot in one place and one foot in another, and it makes it very easy to be stable and to pivot. But to your comment about vocation, yeah, different groups have different you know, levels of kind of the in-depth thought they've given to this, and you know, how they technically define it. But I think, you know, I think it's a process of uncovering the strengths that you have. One thing this is getting off on a tangent, but there's a, you know, one of the kind of tropes in science fiction is this idea of, like, there's a huge problem to be solved, and somehow the hero shows up, and the hero in science fiction is not necessarily the strongest person or the guy with the best weapon, but it's the person who can see things in a way no one else can see them. Right. And by seeing them, like, he can see around this obstacle that other people can't see around. And I think there's something really, really compelling about that idea, that we all, because of our situation, our experiences, our context, we have insights that nobody else has. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about with, we all live in the developing world. It's not just important that we all continue developing. It's important because, like, every place in the world has a different insight into the problems that are facing us, and a different kind of window on what we're seeing. So, you know, somebody in Silicon Valley is not seeing the problems of someone in Lagos, Nigeria, whose electricity shuts off every 4 hours. Right. And then they turn on a gas generator and you know, get their lights back on. That's you know, there's a whole world of people living like that, and who are constantly facing that problem and thinking about it, versus the people in Silicon Valley who don't know of that problem at all, right, on a practical level. So we have to tap into that. We have to realize, like, oh, we do have a unique perspective to bring to this. What does that mean in terms of what skills and talents that gives us, and what problem-solving abilities that other people just don't have? And I think that really kind of forms the core, for me, of thinking about those kinds of questions.
Awesome. I think that's a good stopping point. I want to thank you for coming onto the show, and I'm sure we'll have you back in the future, not just here, but also in person at an academy, or maybe even just for hanging out again. And thanks for having you here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later.
See ya.